Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another glorious edition of Ask That. My name is Clark Sell, your hostess with the mostest. It is a beautiful, well, it's kind of a gloomy Friday, but it is a Friday. And for those who own businesses, mean it's a Wednesday. And with me today, I have a friend, somebody who I admired for a number of years, Doc Norton. How are you, sir?
I am well. How are you?
I am fantastic. I have been looking forward to this conversation for a number of reasons, of which we will get into. And I think to give the people a bit of a foreshadowing, we're going to talk about organizations and efficiencies and bullshit and the like. But before we get to that, why don't you tell everybody who you are?
Yeah. So I'm Doc Norton. I am. Boy, I hate to say I'm an agile coach because, well, I feel like the profession is being tainted. But I really, I'm a process and leadership coach. I go into organizations and I help them get better at delivering software. I've been doing that for, well, maybe 30 some years, either because my hands are on the keys and I was actually delivering the software, or manager, director, CTO in companies, and then finally moving into more of a consulting space. But yeah, my life is about delivering software better.
So this is something that, as somebody who's built software for a couple of decades now, which is, I hate saying that, it just makes me feel old. I am a very much a pragmatic person. When I grew up building cars, I think of software like cars. They're pieces that can get posed. There are many ways. It's an art form of how to build it. But the culture that sits around you really, one of my beliefs is that the culture that sits around you really starts to dictate how the software is built. And whether that's team structure or, culture in its truest sense, those things start to bleed into the thing that gets built and how it gets delivered and the time that it takes. I mean, is that just kind of a BS statement from Clark, or because I don't feel like we acknowledge the fact that culture is such a big player in the output of the product.
Yeah. No, it's not a BS statement from Clark. You have fairly well in the last 30 seconds paraphrased Conway's Law. Right. So Conway's Law, and again, paraphrasing, the systems we build are a direct reflection of the social structures that build them. So, when you look at any organization, and whatever it is that they're producing, it doesn't matter if it's software. It could be cars or tanks or anything, right? Every place that there's a separation between people because they're, this group and this group,
sure.
It's in those seams that you ultimately find the defects, the bugs, the flaws, the majority of them at least, right? And the way that we organize, the way that we structure has a direct influence on the behavior inside of the organization, which is all part of the culture. So it's absolutely direct correlations.
So I think, and I want to kind of dispel this some with you, but I think people hear that and then they think of like, oh, I need a sprint team, and my sprint team needs a scrum master, but it's way bigger than just like a 5-person team.
Oh yeah. No, So the whole like the small teams, two pizza size team. What is it? The two pizza team?
Know, but
Yeah. So it's a relatively common phrase. It's actually a funny phrase, right? Because I think it was from Amazon that like, oh yeah, our teams are 2 pizza teams. They're small enough that you could feed them with 2 large pizzas. And one of my buddies was like, "That's me, right? I could eat 2 large pizzas, therefore I am a team." But anyway, this idea of like these small teams, yes, I think that helps when you start to look at things like Dunbar's number and the way that communication moves through any given system. But taking a large group of people, breaking them up into small teams, and saying go doesn't necessarily solve some of the other challenges. And if the way that you have structured them, or the way that you are actually coordinating the work is if those things are incongruent, you're going to end up with a bunch of additional challenges anyway. So yeah, small team Scrum Master is not going to solve the problem.
Yeah, and I feel like the coordinating of the work, like the mechanics of that are whatever. Like like so many people having worked at Microsoft and now with my own company of two, like we used to always get people like I want to do it like Microsoft does it, and I would go, you don't have 5,000 developers on your product. Like,
right.
Stop looking for inspiration here. Like I appreciate the fact that you think we've figured it out, but our culture is different, and the Windows team is different than the other team, and sure there's some similarities, but you have 10 developers, and so like the mechanics and the ceremony of how to just schedule work and do shit, it's like you could just look over and say, hey, Jim or Jane, hey, right? Like you're not physically in another building, so
right.
It's just different. So, like, what would you say are some of the just in the cultural sense? What are some of the biggest problems, or how do you even identify that these problems exist in the first place?
Well, so like if I'm going into a company, how do I identify what's sort of the key cultural problems?
Yeah, I mean, you walk in, right, and people have blinders, right? They only know what they know, or they've never seen it any different. And yet maybe sometimes they don't even want to admit that, hey, this stuff is screwed up in the first place. Or they think, oh, it's my sprint teams, everything's cool.
Right. So it's interesting. One of the things that I've noticed, and I've had this happen over and over again, is we're oftentimes looking at the behavior of the people, right? So I had a client 2 years ago now, and I won't get into a ton of detail on it, but they had a team in particular that they were really having a hard time with. This, look, these people are, they're very opaque. They don't share. They're argumentative all the time. They seem like they're super defensive. And all of these issues, we can't figure out what it is. The leader seems like, she's pretty cool, but then the team is still, a real problem, and we swapped out players, and all this is happening. What's going on? And so I sat down.
You grab a mirror and go, take a look.
That's pretty much it, right? So we sat down and looked at it and said, okay, I did a bit of some interviews and actually observing and kind of trying to figure things out, and realized, all right, you've got this team that's at the center of everything, and all other teams are dependent upon them. And you've not only given them their own charter and demand, things that they must deliver, but they also have to support all of these other relationships. Right. You've created a situation where the only thing they can do is keep it as tight and private as possible. Yeah. So
they're losing every hour of the day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's usually it. So that's maybe a more extreme example, but that's usually it. It's that we've designed a system that ultimately necessitates this type of behavior, whether it's good behavior or bad behavior.
Yeah.
And leadership often asks for help, and the help they're asking for is make those people better.
Yeah. It's funny when you say that. I often see groups say we need to make our developers more productive, but yet never say I need to make the BAs or the testers or the support group or the operations or the deployment. It's always, I'm not getting enough done with the developers. It's never anything else.
I had
broad strokes, of course.
No, definitely. I just had this conversation the other day. But many years ago, I had a client that I went into, and it was the same thing. They said, look, we need XP practices because we want the developers to move faster.
Right.
Things just aren't getting done quickly enough. I said, okay, you might actually need that. And came in and started teaching them that. But we started getting cycle times against all the different stages and lead times against the work, right? And what we found was the lead time of any item from, hey, wouldn't it be nice if, to, hey, ain't that nice, was about 40 days, right?
Yeah.
The cycle time for development on average was 4 days. So if we grind on these developers and we push them and we train them and we cajole them, we could get them 25% faster. They'll be down to 3 days.
Right.
And your lead time will be 39 days. Like this is not the problem. This is the problem.
Yeah. Getting people to see that though seems like a giant hurdle.
Yeah, that's actually, one of the things that I do when I go into organizations, at least try to do, is get those measurements. What are the lead times? What are the cycle times of each of the stages? Create a cumulative flow diagram so you can actually see how work is moving through the system. Mm-hmm. And you can start having conversations about where are the actual bottlenecks? What is this stuff that that slows us down, and then go address that. Yeah. And not everyone is open to that. Yeah.
The other thing I struggle with is, for me, software is this composition, and you have to have a destination, right? You have to have some idea of where it's going. Now, granted, the destination is always changing, right?
Sure.
No doubt in 6 months we will have something better that we can do. But the boat, as it meanders back and forth, needs to be headed in kind of the right direction, and people need to understand that direction. I say that because one of my premises has always been, when you compose software, there's a certain order of which things can be done to better gain those efficiencies down the road. And at times I feel like the business group or the analysts or whatnot don't take that same appreciation, and they say, here's a bunch of work, without necessarily being mindful of like, well, this work would stack together better if we did it a different way. And I don't see that really represented well enough or understood well enough.
Yeah, I agree. And I think some of this comes down to trust, history, et cetera, right? Trying to help organizations. For a long time, I was the coaching was around thin slicing and being able to get small pieces through, and that type of work. And ultimately, that's still what we're going after. But now I really try and listen more to the business and have conversations about how we can de-risk the delivery of this system. Right. Mm-hmm. So if there's some core piece of functionality that absolutely positively has to be delivered, then let's start on that. And maybe there's some supporting stuff that at launch could actually be hard coded or even faked, and totally. People wouldn't notice, and how do we think about the project in that way? And then how do we execute in that way? And it definitely takes coaching, training, patience to kind of get people thinking in that direction. I think part of it is, I think a lot of this goes back to how stuff in most organizations, how are things budgeted? It's budgeted as a project, right? It took me 4 months to get this budget together and get it approved. And damn it, I'm going to deliver everything that this budget was justified by. Yeah. And if we actually looked at software projects as investment portfolios, mm-hmm. and started to think about like, all right, I'm going to put some money in here. Am I getting a return? Yeah. If I'm getting a return, I'll keep investing. If I'm not getting a return, I should put that money someplace else.
Yep. Yeah. I got an argument, a couple of weeks back that like, if we're just building the same thing, then there's no point of spending any money. Like, nobody's asking to use your pile of shit software. You're trying to enable another human or another system to be more productive, to do business with you. So if your feature, in fact, does not do that, why are we wasting our time? There's no point whatsoever to do this. Yeah. And it was like, well, we just got to. All right.
Yeah, it's on the list. Right.
Yeah. Okay. I guess we'll truck on with that one then.
Right. Well, it's to some extent, depending on how that manifests, I often refer to that as hubris-driven development, where some executive decided that this is going to be valuable and everyone's going to love it, and we don't have to do anything to actually verify or validate that hypothesis, right? It's just going to be awesome, so build it.
And I played product manager for multi-million-dollar products for many years, and as a PM on a product, you're very much like have to get customer validation. You have to get buy-in on constituents and release plans and all of that stuff, right? We just don't,
Yeah.
you just don't, build a $15 million product and make a change because you feel like the widget should be moved.
Right.
And yet I feel like a lot of people, a lot of organizations don't actually treat their, I'm going to use your words, their investment portfolio as an actual product itself. And because when you say the word product, you immediately think of either things in boxes or deployable units or how they're manufactured. But the reality is your structure, the product, if you think in those terms, it can change all that other stuff instead of like this big monolithic system. And, hey, we move widgets around the world or make bearings. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
But getting people to think in that product mindset, I've struggled with, and I don't know if it's just because I've worked for the tech companies and everything was a product with a SKU and a sellable unit to an end consumer versus the kind of enterprisey type world where that's not
right. Right. Well, yeah, especially in a lot of places, we're building software for internal consumers or some captive audience that has little choice. And it's interesting what that does to the mentality. It almost seems like in those cases we feel as though it doesn't really matter. They have to use it anyway. Yeah. And don't realize that if we approached it the same way that we would a sellable product, we would actually be able to realize greater efficiencies and gains, internal to the organization because they'd be able to do their jobs, easier. And
your support times are less and new features roll out the door. And back to the return and measuring.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And when you sell a product, right, and the revenue is behind it, typically you are very, very interested in what your return on that investment is because you've got to clear your numbers for the next year.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how do you, when do you know that it's going well? I mean, I know you can always improve, but how do you know when you're actually doing well? What does that look like?
Are you saying as a team, yeah. So I think
loosely defined, whatever some structure is, like how can you feel good about what you're doing?
Yeah. So I can certainly speak to teams where I've seen some of these behaviors. There's a high level of conversation interaction. Folks are actually getting along with one another. There's clear understanding of what we're building and why.
Is this at the macro level or the micro level?
At both, really, right? So certainly at the micro level, people understanding who needs help today, what's the most important thing that we're working on right now, and moving stuff across the line. You start hearing people talk about things like they start talking about work in progress and limiting that and making sure that they're not doing too many things, and they start talking about holding each other accountable to what are the priorities. You start seeing these types of behaviors. So it's not externally enforced. There isn't some manager who's reminding everyone these are the priorities today. It's the team actually holding one another accountable. Yeah. Larger organizations, it's kind of the same thing, but it scales up where if I'm working on something here today, I should, I can actually articulate what it is that I'm doing, how that is intended to add value to whoever our end customer is, and how that ties to the broader vision of the organization. And places that I go into where it's really bad, you don't have that line of sight at all. Developers, testers, they're working on a piece of work that does a thing, but they don't know what key strategic initiative is this tied to, and does the customer actually use this piece of the software or care at all?
Yeah. How for the, I'll say for the non-product products that are still products, even though I said non-product products, like what level of like instrumentation, you know, you'll see the stories of two sides. You'll see the technical committees or folks trying to get technical stuff in, and then you'll see the business folks trying to get business stuff in. And there'll be this like contention back, like, no, we just need more features for the business. And it's like, yeah, but these are those two. I understand that they're not on the website, but like, how does one like make the technical thing just as important as the other so that you can get the measurements and the response time and all that to say, yeah, this is working for us. People use that button.
Right. Right. So I guess there's a couple of things in there. One, I tend to try and get teams to begin with adding just simple static analysis to their pipeline, which may seem a little weird, but what that typically does is introduces the idea of internal code quality. And you've got some objective measure about that. So now when we talk about quality, we have something that we can point to besides Joe's opinion, right? Because if you ask two experts, Joe and Janet,
they're going to be different.
They're going to be different because of what they're comfortable with, et cetera. So how do we move that into an objective space that we can then have a conversation about? Oh, well, high cyclomatic complexity is bad, I guess. Tight coupling probably makes the code unmaintainable. Those types of things, right?
And to be fair, even if it is wrong, at least it's a measurement of, at least it's something to then make a decision to go one way or another. It really doesn't even necessarily, wrong or not wrong. It's something that you can use.
Yes. And so now we can actually look at what's our throughput, and we can look at, how are defects going, right? If it turns out, sorry, my lines are bad. But if it turns out that like the quality of the code is decaying at a rapid pace, what adjustments can we make? What we want is what is the rate that we can move at that allows us to maintain a decent code base. Now that's just internal quality. So then we start talking about how do we actually know if people are using this, and that can be harder depending on the environment. So one of the things is the language that you start using, right? So any feature, any request, start referring to it as a hypothesis. So the hypothesis is if we make the button blue, more people will buy. Interesting. How could we validate that hypothesis? How would we know for sure that's happening, right? And start using that type of language can move people in the direction of, yeah, okay, well, how would we measure that? And we can start getting instrumentation into the code. One of the challenges a lot of places have, so A/B testing, great. A lot of places don't have enough user volume to do multivariate testing. So the difference, just quick, right? A/B is just basically like two options. Multivariate is I'm changing a bunch of options on the screen. And the challenge with that is unless you've got enough volume, you can't determine statistical significance. You won't get enough data. But A/B testing can still be extremely valuable and relatively easy to do. So referring to things as hypothesis, how do we actually validate that? Oftentimes when I'll talk to folks about what's the actual business benefit we want to get and how would we prove that. So one of the questions I'll ask is, if this is successful, what types of stories would you hear? What would your customer say? Right? What types of things? If your customer,
what does it look like in a year?
Yep. If they could walk up to you in the hallway and thank you for the thing you did, what would they say? Now, if someone walked up to you and said that, how would you verify that? Now, if they just said, I think your software is beautiful, you can't verify that. But if they said, man, it now takes me 47% less time to execute this task. How would you verify that? Could we measure that? Right.
Yeah, I mean, people all too often fall into the echo chamber, and they feel like I heard a great response, and then it becomes a pillar of the product. But it's like, well, that's kind of bullshit. Like,
Well,
you heard it from one person, not 5,000.
right, and it's just that basically just amounts to confirmation bias.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
I might have in that same day heard three kind of grumbly comments about the same feature, and wave that off as like, yeah, well, those people, blah, 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 right? Here's someone who loves it.
Yeah.
Therefore
it's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, we used to always have a while back, a group of us, we used to always have a saying that if we're building the product that the customers are asking for and support, then we've built the product that they wanted yesterday and not the product that we're actually trying to build in the first place.
Yeah.
And their support requests are just deficiencies in us trying to predict like what we were solving in the first place. So let's not get so hung up on like, ooh, I got to fix this to make Joe or Jane happy. Let's figure out what the real requirement is and then how to better solve that in 3 months or 4 months or 2
Right.
weeks, whatever have you, which is super, super hard. I mean, you have to be unbiased and step back and say, what value is our service? And I don't mean like, service, but we all provide some service in the great meta way, if I will.
Right. Right.
You had mentioned the hypothesis, which reminded me one of the things that we've always tried to kind of live by is what problem are we solving for somebody else? Like,
Right.
if by doing this, what problem did it solve? What service did it provide? Like, make it very actionable in the, when this is introduced, person can do X, Y, and Z, or person can now do this. And to your point of measuring it, now that they're doing, are they in fact using it?
Yeah. Yeah. How do we measure that? How do we prove it? Yeah. I talk about the hypothesis. So I've got to talk the experimentation mindset, and there's a lot more in that talk than just call it a hypothesis. But some of this, there's a lot of organizations that just don't do well at feeding data back into the engine and actually learning. And some of that is things like we've decided that people would really like this particular feature. We released the feature, it's not getting used. We happen to know that, and we continue to do things like add more functionality to it or change the color of it because we're just totally convinced that if we
more paint will just fix the problem.
Right, absolutely, someone will use it, as opposed to like, all right, what else could we have done to solve the problem? Maybe that's what people need. Or even in some cases looking at how are people actually using the software in the first place? What are they actually doing with it? And what can we infer from that then feeds into the next hypothesis, the next experiment? Yeah. Do you know how Groupon actually started? So Groupon was a social platform, and it wasn't called Groupon. I don't remember what it was anymore. But the idea was that like you want to start a community garden. And so you go on this platform and you say, hey, I live in this area. I want to start a community garden. And other people are like, yeah, me too. And, you get together and you work together and you do these things for the greater good of the world. Right. And so the software is being built and, not much of a revenue model, right. which was a bit of a problem.
Yep.
But started looking at it and something strange happened in AP, so Asia Pacific. They noticed that there were these groups of these groups that were forming and becoming like really high activity for a brief period of time and then disappearing. And then a new one, right? They're like, okay, that's a different use case than some of the others. Because mostly what we get is like it starts and it just sort of then it sustains for a while, right? So they started looking into it. It turns out what these people were doing was they wanted to get luxury items from the United States. But it's very difficult to buy a single luxury item from the United States. So they were grouping together and buying cargo loads full of stuff, right?
Interesting.
They were group buying.
Yeah.
And so that was
Yeah. It reminds me of the Twitter story, right? It started
Yeah.
as like SMS to your friends, and this turned into something tangentially related, right?
Right.
Just at a whole different scale.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it really is. It's about, pay attention to how it's being used and what can you infer from that, and how do you, move, how can you move in that direction to see, like, is there actually something here or is there not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
often reminded of mindfulness and all of that is a big deal today, and I think we as I hate using the term engineer since there's no practical engineering degree, but
Right.
as product people, I think we have to have that moment of clarity with our product and our people and understand how it's being used and why it's being used, um, and where it's important. I remember when I first started at Microsoft, God, this was like '05, and I can remember Bill Gates standing on stage, or somebody who was in bigwig in charge, and they were talking about the stats in Office, and the stat was, this was when they were getting ready to change the ribbon,
Okay.
or whatever, what is now known as the ribbon, but the file menu. They said
Okay.
the biggest problem we have is that people only ever use 10% of our product. So we get tons of support requests because people want to do a thing or they want a new feature, but it's already done and nobody can find it.
They just can't find it.
And nobody knows how to use it. And so the whole invention of the ribbon, the menu bar, was a refactoring of trying to expose features that had already existed. And right, so that bit of mindfulness of like how things are being used, what am I spending my time in, my investment in, right? It's certainly
Yeah.
something we should just be more conscious of on a daily basis.
Yeah.
How,
Yeah.
how do you, like, somewhat switching gears, like,
Yeah.
take everything that we've talked about in this global economy that we have, in this, I can have people from Poland or India or China or Germany, anywhere, like on my development team. How does that change our whole deal? Does it complicate it? Do we have new cultural differences? Does it change? Like, do we really need to treat it as us, them? Can we be a uniform team even though we're 12 hours off and speak different languages?
Yeah, I think it complicates things, right? I do think it makes it more difficult. That said, I at one time, if you'd asked me that question, I would have said, yeah, just don't do that, right? Just don't do it. It's not worth the cost. It's not worth the pain. And depending on the project, the people involved, et cetera, that is still often the advice that I give. Is like, look, you're small, you're trying to move super fast, try and keep people at least in the same time zones, relatively, if not actually in the same office. But if you're doing the distributed thing, one of the things that I'm seeing is, great, then be entirely distributed.
Yeah.
Right? Communication, is like water. It takes the path of least resistance.
Yep.
And if you've got a team of 5 in Chennai, and you've got a team of 5 in Seattle, right? And you've got video links and Slack and everything else between them. This team's communicating high frequency. This team's communicating high frequency, and the communication between them is low frequency and lower value.
Yeah.
If you actually tell everyone, go work from home, then the path of least resistance is Slack and video, and now people will leverage those technologies, and it works.
I love the water analogy, because I've often seen, having worked from home now for 10 years and have done it in multiple environments, the ones who were most productive were the ones who were all in. Like,
yes.
We had all the tools, we knew how to do it, and we were arguably as productive or more productive. We certainly worked more because there's just work at home guilt that exists. But those who don't do it, right, or kind of they support it, it's always difficult.
Yeah.
And for those same reasons, right? The path of the water.
Yeah. Yeah, and so then I still think that time zones can be a challenge, and culturally, yes, there are certainly differences, and we've just got to be aware of some of those nuances, right? And I'm finding more and more that the kind of the generalizations are pretty dangerous too.
Yeah.
The idea that like, oh, well, you're from this area of the world, therefore, when you say this, you actually mean that, or when your head, moves up and down, it actually means something else, or whatever. We have to remember that those generalizations are not universally true.
Yep.
And get to know each individual as an actual individual.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, now we're just getting on life. I mean, we don't even have to go. We don't have to go across the pond to have that conversation.
This is true.
What would be your like doc's advice on like these are the things that we should be doing or strive to be doing kind of day in and day out?
So when I talk to leaders, right, executives in organizations, founders, and that, I tell them there's four things that you need to focus on, and this is specifically for software development and creative types of work, right? You've got to focus on fostering autonomy, connection, excellence, and diversity. People have to have a voice in the way that things are done, in the work that they do. Simple mantra: doers decide. The people that do the work should decide how the work is done. Excellence: people have to understand. People have to be able to actually see progress towards a goal, right? And they've got to know that they're actually growing. And it doesn't mean that they're growing in terms of like, I'm up for my next promotion on the job ladder. I think that stuff I've always thought that stuff was bullshit. And now there are alternate structures that don't require us to climb the ladder. Connection. You got to be connected to the company and its cause and its purpose, or the service that's delivering. It doesn't have to be noble. It just has to be something that gets you excited.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, purpose.
Yeah.
Everybody wants to have purpose and feel good at the end of the day.
Yeah. And you know where we're going. And then connection to, your actual teammates, right? Empathy, that type of thing. And then the diversity is, primarily it's diversity of thought. The more different perspectives we get in the room, especially in a complex domain where we kind of know what we're building, but we don't really know what we're building. That diversity of thought helps us make better decisions and run better experiments. It turns out that if you want to get diversity of thought, an excellent path towards that is to hire for discernible diversity, things that you can see, right? And that actually creates diversity of thought in a number of different ways. But those are the four things I tell leaders to really to focus on fostering. And for many of them, it's super hard. Or the other side of it is they hear that and they go, "Yep, I do all those things."
Yeah.
And the reality is that, well,
no, you think you do.
Yeah, you
think you do. Ask somebody else if they
ask
think
somebody
you do.
else. Yeah. Internal surveys are super helpful. I've used Gallup's stuff, the Gallup 12, for employee engagement surveys. There's plenty of companies that offer different types of ways at looking at like, are employees actually happy? Are they actually engaged? That feedback is valuable and important. If you're going to do that in the organization, there's a couple of things that should happen. You need to make sure that you are openly sharing the information.
Yeah.
And that you are acting on it.
Yeah, that second one's the important one.
Yeah.
I mean, they're both important, but
yeah.
if you don't do anything about it, your next survey is going to be exponentially worse than your first one.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree.
There was a time at which I worked for a company in my younger days, and I was much more naive or bullheaded. And we action was not happening as part of said survey. And what we had come to find out is if people didn't take the survey, action would start to happen because management was graded upon the number of responses, not actually the actionable things. And so we all just decided not to take the damn survey. And so
oh, wow.
there was one quarter when it came in and nobody took it. And when management came into the room and, pulled everybody in and said, oh my God, what's going on? Why didn't anybody take the survey? I was like, what's the point?
Yeah, it's pointless.
There's no point. Nobody's going to do anything about it.
Yeah.
They got their asses handed to them. And
yeah,
it was an interesting cause.
Yeah.
I guess now I've just outed myself for those who may be listening who were part of that effort back in the early 2000s. Sorry.
Sorry.
Maybe I'm not.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, not sorry.
Yeah.
All right, Doc. At the end of every one of these, I love to extend a bit of gratitude and acknowledge the other person. And with that being said, we've known each other for a number of years. We've crossed paths. I'm a stalker on Twitter. I'm a big fan of just kind of who you are, what you do, the vibe, the influence that you try to make. It would be irresponsible of me not to acknowledge the fact that I love every day when you put it out there. I don't know where you get them. I don't know where you come up with the quotes. Just a little piece of inspiration every day, each and every day of like just trying to strive to be better. I think that is, I love seeing it. It's just a small reflection of the bigger Doc and you being out and speaking at conferences and working with people and putting yourself out there. But all being said, I love it. Thank you for doing it. Keep doing it.
Oh,
I don't know.
Absolutely.
I know it's hard to try to come up with stuff every day, but you start to get in that rhythm. I mean, and you got to have it. So.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. It's something that I've been very deliberate about for quite some time. And there are periods where I feel like I'm kind of mailing it in, but I really do try to, to keep the content fresh and to keep it sincere and real. So to hear that people appreciate that it means a lot to me. So thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. So my last question, and it's one that I ask everybody, and it's been a fantastic journey doing this. My question for you is, how is it that you define community and what does it mean to you?
Man, that's a great question. And I wish you'd have told me 2 days ago you're going to ask me that. Yeah.
Nope.
So how do I define community? So I've got to look at some quick models for myself, right? Because I think I think of my family as a community, and then I think of, there's groups that I kind of refer to as my tribe, right? So I won't say all people who identify as agilists are my tribe, but there are many people who do that I feel very connected to. It is a group of people with that have a shared set of interests, desires, right? In some cases, probably a passion for something. For me, my community, they are folks that even if I haven't seen them in a long time, when you see them again, you feel that instant connection, as if not a whole lot of time has actually passed. And so there's a second part to that. What's community and
what's it mean to you?
So I guess I kind of answered both of those, right? Yeah. It's
obviously it's something near and dear to me. But what I've come to learn is that while that is a word in a dictionary that has a singular meaning, we all very much process it differently and refer to it differently. And it's going to be unearthed one day. The great Clark will unearth it.
That's right.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the time. Everybody, thank you for spending the time with us today. It has certainly been a fruitful conversation. Leave a comment for Doc and I. Would love to be part of that conversation, to carry this forward. There's always a lot that we can do to better one another in this journey of building software. Doc, where can people find you?
So I am Doc on Dev everywhere. All the things whack Doc on Dev. So I've been pretty fortunate. I think that's it. So docondev.com is my website, and Twitter, that's my handle. So
All right. Well, with that being said, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Doc, and we will see you next time.